Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun, a great golden coin worn smooth by the endless passage of time, began its slow, weary descent behind the distant purple mountains, painting the sky in broad, lazy strokes of orange and rose. It was a sight that happened every single evening, a performance of such breathtaking beauty that it seemed a terrible shame there was so rarely anyone there to see it. For this was a lonely part of the world, a place of rolling, windswept hills and whispering grasses that stretched on for miles, where the only constant company was the sighing of the wind through the tall pines and the occasional, lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead. And in the very center of all this vast, empty beauty stood a single, small ranch, a stubborn outpost of human life, clinging to the shoulder of the highest hill, as if it were trying to get a little closer to the sun before it disappeared. This was the home of Elias, a man who had become as much a part of the landscape as the ancient, gnarled oak tree that grew beside his house. His was a life of quiet routine, a rhythm measured not by the ticking of a clock, for he owned none, but by the sun's journey across the sky and the needs of the creatures in his care. Each morning, he awoke before the dawn to the sound of his own breathing in the silent house, and he would begin his day by lighting the stove, the single, sharp scratch of the match sounding like a thunderclap in the profound stillness. The house, though small, always felt far too large for him. It was a house built for a family, with a main room that echoed with every footstep and two other bedrooms that stood perpetually empty, their doors always closed, their beds neatly made and waiting for guests who never, ever came. After a simple breakfast of oats and strong, black coffee, Elias would step out onto his porch, his boots making a familiar, hollow thump on the wooden planks, and he would look out over his land. He owned a few dozen sheep, their woolly backs dotting the green hillside like moving stones, and a small herd of dairy cows who would amble slowly toward the barn each evening when he called, their gentle, trusting eyes knowing him as the bringer of food and comfort. His most constant companion was Oak, a horse who was as old and steady as his name suggested, with a coat the color of dust and a temperament so gentle that a butterfly could land on his nose and he wouldn't even twitch. Elias would speak to Oak and to the cows and to the sheep in a low, soft murmur. He would tell the sheep to stay out of the brambles, he would thank the cows for their milk, and he would ask Oak if he was ready for a day of work. These were his conversations. They were not answered with words, but with soft bleats, deep moos, and a quiet, understanding nuzzle from his old horse. It was a companionship, yes, but it was a quiet one, and it did little to fill the deep, hollow silence that waited for him inside the house each night. The work was hard from sunup to sundown, a never-ending cycle of mending fences, hauling water, baling hay, and tending to the animals. Elias's hands were rough and calloused, maps of a lifetime of labor, and his back was strong from carrying countless burdens, both physical and otherwise. He never complained about the work. In fact, he welcomed it. The exhaustion he felt in his muscles at the end of the day was a feeling he understood. It was an honest tiredness. But the other feeling, the one that settled in his chest as the light faded from the sky, was much harder to bear. It was a deep, aching loneliness, a silence so heavy it felt like a weight pressing down on him. He would eat his supper at the large wooden table, alone, with only the crackle of the fire in the hearth for conversation. The clink of his fork against the plate was the only sound in the room. He would look across the table at the empty chair where his wife once sat, her laughter now just a faint, cherished memory that seemed to belong to another man in another life. They had hoped to fill this house with the sounds of children, with pitter-pattering feet and joyful shouts echoing from these very walls. But it was not a blessing they had been given. Now it was just him. On this particular evening, as he finished his stew and listened to the wind picking up outside, moaning softly under the eaves of the roof, the feeling was heavier than usual. The days were getting shorter, and the long, dark nights of winter were approaching, promising even more hours of isolation. He washed his single bowl and spoon, dried them, and put them away in the nearly empty cupboard. He walked through the quiet house, checking the bolt on the door and paused for a moment outside the two closed bedroom doors. He placed his hand on one of them, the wood smooth and cool under his palm. He didn't open it. There was no need. He knew the room inside was spotless, empty, and waiting. It had been waiting for years. With a sigh that was swallowed by the immense silence of the house, Elias the rancher blew out the lamp and went to bed, listening to the sound of the lonely wind, wondering if this was how his life would always be, a beautiful, peaceful, but terribly solitary journey on a hilltop at the edge of the world. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, a sharp, cool autumn day that carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves on its breath. Elias, as was his unshakable habit, was already well into his day's labor by the time the sun finally crested the eastern hills, setting the dewdrops on the long grass ablaze with a million tiny points of light. The routines of the ranch were as familiar to him as the lines on his own face, a series of motions and tasks performed with a quiet, practiced efficiency that required little conscious thought. He mucked out the stalls in the barn, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel a solitary sound in the vastness of the morning. He forked fresh, sweet-smelling hay into the feeders for the cows and sheep, who greeted him with soft, expectant noises, their warm breath pluming in the chilly air. He drew water from the deep, stone-lined well, the bucket rising heavy and cold, its contents splashing onto the ground as he carried it to the troughs. It was peaceful work, but it was work done in a bubble of silence, broken only by animal sounds and the endless whisper of the wind. There was a certain emptiness to it all, a feeling that all this effort was for naught if there was no one to share its fruits with, no one to sit across from at the end of the day and say, "We accomplished this together." It was this very emptiness, this nagging sense of something vital missing from the fabric of his life, that finally propelled him into action shortly after his midday meal. He had noticed his supply of salt for the animals was running dangerously low, and a few other essentials, flour, coffee, a new whetstone for his tools, were needed in town. A trip to Maple Bend was a necessity, but one he often put off for as long as possible. The town, small as it was, always felt too loud, too crowded, too full of the hurried energy of other people's lives, a stark contrast to the slow, deliberate pace of his own existence on the hill. With a resigned sigh, he brushed the hay from his trousers, gave old Oak a pat on his sturdy neck, and prepared for the journey. He harnessed the horse to the small, worn wagon that was used for such errands, its wheels complaining with a familiar, high-pitched squeak that echoed across the quiet yard. The ride into town was a long one, a good hour and a half of steady plodding along a dirt road that wound its way through valleys and past other, larger farms. Elias was in no particular hurry, and Oak seemed to sense this, maintaining a slow, steady pace that allowed his master to take in the changing colors of the forest, the busy scuttling of squirrels gathering their winter stores, the majestic flight of a bald eagle high overhead. It was a world preparing for the sleep of winter, a beautiful and somber spectacle. As he drew closer to Maple Bend, however, the signs of human activity increased. The fences along the road were in better repair, the fields more neatly tended, and soon other wagons and people on horseback began to appear on the road, nodding a brief greeting as they passed, their faces set with the purpose of their own errands. When he finally guided Oak onto the main street of Maple Bend, Elias immediately sensed that something was different. The town was not just busy, it was positively buzzing with a tense, anxious energy. There were far more people than usual milling about on the wooden boardwalks that ran in front of the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the post office. Small clusters of men and women stood talking in hushed, serious tones, their faces drawn and worried. The usual cheerful clang of the blacksmith's hammer was absent, and instead, a low, worried murmur hung in the air, like the hum of a beehive that has been disturbed. Elias felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. He didn't like crowds, and he especially didn't like the feeling of shared anxiety that seemed to radiate from everyone around him. He quickly set about his tasks, hoping to be in and out as fast as possible. He purchased his sack of salt, his bag of flour, and the other items he needed, loading them into the back of his wagon with brisk efficiency. It was as he was about to climb back onto the wagon seat and escape the oppressive atmosphere of the town that he noticed the largest crowd of all. Dozens of people were gathered in a tight, somber knot around the front of the post office, all their attention focused on a single piece of paper nailed to the building's weather-beaten door. Their silence was more alarming than any noise could have been. Curiosity, a feeling he rarely indulged, got the better of him. Tying Oak's reins to a hitching post, he made his way slowly toward the back of the crowd, his tall frame allowing him to see over the heads of most of the others. He saw the notice. It was printed in large, stark black letters on an official-looking sheet of parchment. He had to squint a little to read it from this distance, the words slowly coming into focus. It was a notice of a public auction, the kind held when someone could not pay their debts. His heart sank as he read the name of the family involved. It was the Millers, his neighbors from the next valley over. Good, hard-working people. Thomas Miller was a proud and capable farmer, and his wife, and was known for her kindness and her beautiful garden. They had 3 young children, a boy and 2 little girls, who were always bright-eyed and polite. Elias's eyes scanned down the notice, listing the family's possessions to be sold: livestock, farm equipment, their plow, their wagon. It was an inventory of a life's work, all being taken away. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes reached the very bottom of the notice. The final item, listed as coldly and impersonally as a table or a chair, was Lot 7. The words seemed to blur for a second before he forced himself to read them, a cold dread washing over him. It stated, in that same unfeeling black type, Lot 7, the entire Miller family. Indentured servitude to the highest bidder to settle outstanding debts. Starting bid, $5. Elias felt the world tilt slightly around him. The murmur of the crowd seemed to fade into a distant roar. He stared at those words, reading them over and over again, unable to fully comprehend their cruelty. They were going to sell the family. They were going to treat Thomas and those 3 innocent children like property to be bought and owned by whoever had the most money. The starting price was a mockery, an insultingly small amount that highlighted how little say they had in their own futures. The auction was to be held the very next day. Elias stood rooted to the spot, the supplies he had just bought forgotten, his mind reeling with the horror of it all. The loneliness of his hilltop ranch suddenly seemed a far kinder fate than the one that awaited his neighbors. The night that followed Elias's return from Maple Bend was the longest and most restless he had ever endured within the walls of his quiet home. Sleep was an impossible notion, a distant country he could not hope to visit. For every time he closed his eyes, the stark, black letters of that terrible notice burned against the inside of his eyelids, spelling out a fate so cruel it chilled him to his very bones. He tossed and turned on his mattress, the familiar creaks of the bed frame sounding like screams of protest in the oppressive silence of the house. The wind, usually a comforting whisper, now seemed to moan with a shared sorrow, carrying on its breath the imagined cries of the Miller children. He rose before the first faint hint of light touched the eastern horizon, moving through the dark rooms like a ghost, his movements automatic and heavy with a dread that was a physical weight upon his shoulders. He could not eat the breakfast he prepared. The food tasted like ash in his mouth, and the coffee, usually a welcome jolt of warmth, sat in his stomach like a cold, leaden stone. His mind was a turbulent storm of fragmented thoughts and helpless anger. He was not a man of great influence or wealth. He was a simple rancher, and the world of debts and auctions and the cold, hard laws of commerce were foreign and terrifying to him. What could he possibly do? The journey back into town that morning was a somber, funeral procession of one. Old Oak seemed to sense his master's profound distress, plodding along the familiar road with an uncharacteristic slowness, his head bowed, as if in respect for the gravity of the day. Elias did not urge him on. Each turn of the wagon's wheels, each clopping step of the horse's hooves, felt like a countdown to an inevitable tragedy, drawing him closer to a scene he desperately wished he could avoid. The beautiful autumn day felt like a mockery. The sun was too bright, the the sky too blue, the air too crisp and clean for the ugliness that was about to unfold. As he approached the outskirts of Maple Bend, he saw a great number of wagons and horses already tethered along the road, a sure sign that a large portion of the county had turned out for the event. For many, it was a grim spectacle, a break from the monotony of farm life. For others, it was a chance to acquire needed tools or livestock at a bargain price. For Elias, it felt like walking toward an execution. He guided his wagon to the very edge of the town square, finding a spot far from the main crowd, under the sparse shade of a half-bare maple tree. He did not unhitch Oak from the wagon, wanting to be able to leave quickly if the sight became too much for him to bear. The square was packed with people, a sea of faces both familiar and strange, all buzzing with a low, excited chatter that grated on Elias's nerves. At the center of it all, on a raised wooden platform usually reserved for town criers or traveling musicians, stood the possessions of the Miller family. He saw their hay wagon, their plow, their harrow, all the tools Thomas had used to work his land. He saw their milk cow, a gentle brown-eyed creature, looking confused and anxious as she lowed softly. And then he saw them, huddled together on the platform, off to the side, were the Millers themselves. Thomas stood tall, but his face was a mask of pale, stoic shame, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon, unable to meet the gaze of the crowd. And stood beside him, one arm wrapped tightly around her husband's, the other holding her two younger daughters close to her skirts. Her face was etched with a quiet, terrifying despair, but her head was held high, a final, fragile act of dignity. The boy, Peter, who was maybe 10 years old, stood rigidly, trying to imitate his father's bravery, but his lower lip trembled betrayingly. The two little girls, their names Lily and Rose, clung to their mother's legs, their faces buried in her dress, confused and frightened by the noise and the staring eyes of the crowd. The auction began. A man in a fine waistcoat and a tall hat, the auctioneer, stepped onto the platform, his voice a loud, rapid-fire instrument that cut through the murmuring of the crowd. He held a gavel in his hand, which he smacked against the lectern to call for attention. The selling of the family's worldly goods commenced. Elias watched, his heart aching, as Thomas's prize plow was sold to a man from the next county. He watched their wagon go to the owner of the livery stable. He watched their cow be led away by a farmer Elias knew to be harsh with his animals. Each strike of the gavel was like a physical blow to Thomas Miller, who flinched ever so slightly with each sale, each item representing a piece of his life's work, his dreams for his family, being dismantled and carried away before his eyes. The crowd cheered and bid, caught up in the thrill of the chase, seemingly oblivious to the human tragedy playing out just a few feet away. Finally, the last tool was sold, the last piece of furniture was hauled away. A tense, anticipatory hush fell over the square. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his demeanor shifting from cheerful salesman to something colder, more businesslike. He turned and gestured toward the huddled family. And now, Lot 7, his voice rang out too loud, too casual for the words he was about to speak. A ready-made workforce, a strong man, a capable woman, and 3 young helpers. Indentured servitude to the highest bidder until the debts are worked off. Who will start the bidding? Do I hear $5? For a heartbeat, there was only a sickening, awful silence. Then, a voice, rough and familiar, called out from the front of the crowd. $5. Elias's blood ran cold. It was Silas Granger, a rancher from the Northern Valley, a man known for his vast holdings and his miserly, cruel nature. He owned a massive spread and worked his hired men to the bone, paying them little and treating them worse. A mean, greedy light was in his eyes as he stared at the family on the platform, not seeing people, but seeing unpaid labor, seeing property. The auctioneer grinned. $5. I have 5. Who will give me 10? Another man, a farmer Elias didn't recognize, bid 10. Silas Granger immediately countered with 15. The bid went back and forth, climbing slowly, agonizingly. The family on the platform seemed to shrink with each higher number, their fate being bartered over like a side of beef. Granger's voice, loud and confident, always topped the others. He finally shouted, $20. The other farmer shook his head and fell silent. The auctioneer's voice rose in a crescendo. $20. I have 20. A bargain for a strong back and a lifetime of service. Going once. He looked across the crowd. Elias's hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Going twice, the auctioneer called, raising his gavel high into the air. Silas Granger smirked, a look of vile triumph on his face. It was over. The hammer began its descent. In that final, suspended moment before the auctioneer's gavel could fall, sealing the Miller family's fate with a single, definitive crack of sound, time itself seemed to warp and slow to a thick, syrupy crawl for Elias. The smirk on Silas Granger's face was a grotesque mask of victory, a sight so vile it seemed to burn itself into Elias's vision. The despair on the faces of Thomas and Miller was a physical pain in his own chest, a wrenching agony that eclipsed any loneliness he had ever felt on his quiet hill. He saw the small, trembling hands of the little girls clutching their mother's skirts, and the boy, Peter, trying so desperately to be the man his father could no longer be in this moment. These were not lots on an inventory sheet. They were people. They were a family, hearts beating with the same fear and hope as his own, their spirits about to be crushed under the weight of a $20 debt and the greed of a cruel man. A lifetime of quiet solitude, of watching sunsets alone and eating meals in silence, of conversations with livestock and the echo of his own footsteps in an empty house. All of it coalesced into a single, seismic surge of emotion that rose from the very depths of his being. It was not a calculated decision. It was not a plan. It was a raw, instinctive eruption of everything he had ever wanted and everything he knew to be right, a defiance against the cold, transactional cruelty of the world before him. His voice, when it came, did not sound like his own. It was not the soft murmur he used with Oak or the sheep. It was not the hesitant, polite tone he used in town. It was a voice forged from a lifetime of calling animals across wide valleys, a voice that carried the strength of a man who had spent decades laboring under the sun and the strength of a heart that had finally, irrevocably, broken open. It was clear, strong, and it cut through the tense silence of the square like a clap of thunder on a still summer day. "They're mine." The three words rang out, powerful and absolute, echoing off the storefronts and causing every single head in the crowd to snap around in unified surprise. The auctioneer's gavel halted in midair, his mouth hanging open in stunned confusion. Silas Granger's smug smirk vanished, replaced first by bewilderment and then by a swift, hot flush of anger. All eyes, wide with shock and curiosity, turned to find the source of this interruption. Elias did not wait for their permission or their understanding. He began to move. He stepped away from the shadow of his wagon, away from the safety of the crowd's periphery, and started walking toward the wooden platform. His boot heels struck the hard-packed earth of the square with a firm, deliberate rhythm that seemed to be the only sound in the suddenly hushed world. He did not look at the gawking faces of his neighbors. His gaze was fixed intently, unwaveringly, on the Miller family. He saw the confusion in their eyes, the faint, terrified spark of a hope they did not dare to feel. He walked past Silas Granger, who recovered his voice enough to spit out, "What is the meaning of this? What can you offer, old man? I bid $20. Granger's voice was a harsh, grating thing, full of indignation and a sense of violated privilege. Elias reached the front of the crowd and stepped into the small, open space before the auctioneer's platform. He finally turned to face the auctioneer, but his posture, his entire being, was angled toward the Millers. He stood tall, his worn work clothes a stark contrast to the auctioneer's fine waistcoat and Granger's expensive jacket. He was a man of the earth, standing before men of commerce, and he represented something they had utterly forgotten. The auctioneer, flustered and irritated at the disruption of his proceedings, found his voice. "Now see here, sir. You must abide by the rules. The bid is $20. Do you wish to raise it? The bid must be in monetary value. He waved his gavel impatiently, as if shooing away a bothersome fly. This was the moment. Elias turned his head slowly from the auctioneer to look directly at Silas Granger, and then he let his gaze sweep across the entire assembled crowd, making silent contact with dozens of pairs of eyes. He saw curiosity, skepticism, and in a few, a dawning understanding. When he spoke again, his voice was still strong, but it had changed. The thunder was gone, replaced by a profound, resonant gravity, each word chosen with care and imbued with a truth that was undeniable. "I do not bid money," he began, and the simplicity of the statement alone was enough to cause a renewed wave of murmuring through the crowd. He paused, letting the confusion settle. "I bid a home." He turned and pointed a work-roughened finger toward the road that led out of town, toward the distant hill. "I have a sturdy roof that does not leak. I have 4 strong walls that keep out the wind. There are beds enough and blankets enough to keep away the cold." He then turned his attention fully to the millers, his expression softening into something heartbreakingly kind. "I bid a share of my land and my food. My fields are not vast, but they are fertile. My table is not lavish, but no one who sits at it will ever know hunger. There is milk from my cows, bread from my oven, and stew from my pot, and it will be shared equally as one shares with family." He took a step closer to the platform, his eyes locking with Thomas's, then Anne's, including the children in his gaze. "I bid safety." The word hung in the air, a powerful promise. Safety from harsh words and harder labor. Safety for children to be children and not little workers. Safety for a man to heal his body and his pride, and for a woman to tend a home without fear. The crowd was utterly captivated now. The silence, so complete one could hear the rustle of a falling leaf from the maple trees lining the square. The auctioneer stood dumbfounded, his gavel forgotten at his side. Silas Granger was fuming, his face a thundercloud, but he was powerless against the sheer moral force of Elias's offer. Finally, Elias's voice dropped slightly, but it lost none of its power, carrying an emotional weight that pressed on every heart present. "I do not want servants," he said, the words sounding dirty and small in the clean air. "I would like a family." He let those words settle, let them bloom in the silence. He then turned back to the auctioneer, not with defiance, but with a calm, unshakable certainty. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and drew out 5 silver coins. They were old, worn smooth from years of carrying, but they caught the sunlight. He stepped forward and placed them, one by one, with deliberate slowness, into the auctioneer's limp, open hand. The coins made a soft, metallic clink that was the loudest sound in the world. "I accept the starting bid," Elias said, his voice firm. "But my true offer is my heart." He closed the auctioneer's fingers over the coins. "It is the only thing of real value I have to give." The silence that followed Elias's words was not merely an absence of sound. It was a palpable, living thing that settled over the town square of Maple Bend, thick and heavy as a winter fog. It was a silence of collective breath being held, of dozens of minds struggling to process something they had never before witnessed, something that defied the very foundations of the event they had all gathered to observe. For a long, suspended moment, nothing moved. The auctioneer stood frozen, his hand still closed around the 5 silver dollars Elias had pressed into it, his face a comical mask of utter bewilderment, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were trying to form a word his brain had not yet supplied. His gavel, the symbol of his authority and the instrument of finality, hung uselessly at his side. Silas Granger's features had contorted from smug triumph into a purpling rage, his hands clenched into meaty fists at his sides. But for the moment, even his bluster was stifled by the sheer, unprecedented audacity of the offer. He looked from Elias to the auctioneer and back again, his small, angry eyes darting about as if searching for the rulebook that had just been so thoroughly torn up and thrown to the wind. All eyes were fixed on Elias, but he was no longer looking at the crowd or the flummoxed auctioneer. His entire attention was focused on the Miller family on the platform. He saw the tears welling in Anne's eyes, not tears of despair now, but of a stunned, disbelieving hope so powerful it seemed to shake her very frame. He saw the rigid posture of Thomas Miller softened by a fraction, a faint, almost imperceptible light returning to his eyes as he stared at Elias, trying to comprehend the lifeline that had just been thrown to them from the most unexpected of places. The children, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere even if they couldn't fully understand its meaning, peeked out from behind their mother's skirts, their small faces pale but curious, their wide eyes fixed on the tall, serious rancher who had spoken with such strange and wonderful words. It was the auctioneer who broke the spell, though his voice was now stripped of its former booming confidence, emerging as a confused and hesitant squeak. Now see here," he stammered, looking down at the coins in his hand as if they were foreign objects. This is most irregular. This is not how an auction is conducted. The bid must be a monetary bid. You cannot bid a house and safety." He sputtered the words, his professional world view crumbling around him. "The offer is $20 from Mr. Granger. A legal and binding cash offer." This seemed to jolt Silas Granger back to life. "That's right," he roared, taking a menacing step forward, his finger jabbing the air toward Elias. "This is nonsense. Sentimental drivel. I have a high bid with cold, hard cash. 20 real dollars. This pauper offers a storybook tale and $5. The law is on my side. Now finish it." He turned his furious glare on the auctioneer, demanding compliance. But the spell had been broken for everyone else, too. A low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, but it was different from the earlier excited chatter. It was a murmur of contemplation, of dawning realization. A woman near the front, her face kind and worn from her own life's labors, spoke up, her voice clear and firm. "I heard an offer," she said. "A better offer." A man next to her, a farmer who had bid on Thomas's plow earlier, nodded slowly. He grunted. He met the starting bid. "And I'd say his is the higher offer in the ways that matter." Another voice joined in, then another. "He's right. You can't put a price on a home. Let the family choose. Granger wants workers. Elias is offering a family." The murmurs grew into a groundswell of support, not shouted, but stated with a firm and growing conviction. The people of Maple Bend were not wealthy. They knew the value of money, but they also knew the value of kindness, of community, of a warm hearth on a cold night. They saw in Elias's offer something true, something real that Silas Granger's money could never buy. The auctioneer looked from Granger's furious, red face to the resolute, calm face of Elias, and then out at the crowd, which was now visibly and vocally on the side of the rancher. He was a man of business, but he was not a completely heartless man. He understood the mood of a crowd, and he understood, in that moment, that to bring his gavel down for Silas Granger would be to ignite a riot of disapproval that would stain his reputation forever. He looked down again at the $5 silver in his palm. The law, in its strictest sense, was on Granger's side. But justice seemed to be standing quietly in a worn pair of boots before him. Elias, sensing the shift, spoke again, his voice calm but unwavering, directed at the auctioneer but meant for all to hear. "The notice said starting bid, $5. I have met it. The purpose of this auction is to settle a debt and provide for the family's future. I have offered a path that does both, without stripping them of their dignity. Can Mr. Granger's money promise them that?" He didn't wait for an answer. He already knew it. He turned to Silas Granger. "Will you offer them a home, Silas? Or just a roof over their heads in your bunkhouse? Will you offer them a place at your table? Or just scraps from your kitchen? Will you treat his children as your own, or as little hands to be worked until they are raw?" Each question was a hammer blow, highlighting the stark, brutal reality of what Granger's win would mean. Granger had no answer. He could only splutter, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. He looked around at the crowd, at the faces now turned against him, and he saw no allies, only judgment. With a final, inarticulate snarl of fury, he turned on his heel. "This is a farce," he shouted to no one in particular. "A waste of my time. Keep them. See how far kindness pays your own debts." And with that, he shoved his way through the crowd, stormed over to his horse, mounted it roughly, and rode away at a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust and a settled silence in his wake. All eyes returned to the auctioneer. He let out a long, slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at the $5 in his hand, then at Elias, then at the Miller family, who were watching him, their fate still hanging in the balance. Slowly, with a sense of ceremony that felt more meaningful than all the gavel pounding that had come before, he placed the coins into the debt collector's purse. He did not raise his gavel. Instead, he simply nodded, first to Elias, and then to Thomas, Ann, and Miller. "The bid is accepted," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "The debt is settled. The family is yours." It was over. The crowd did not cheer. They simply let out a collective sigh, a release of tension, and then they began to disperse, shaking their heads in wonder, the story already forming on their lips to be told and retold for years to come. Elias stood his ground, waiting, as the Miller family, hesitantly, as if waking from a terrible dream, stepped down from the platform. The journey from the tense, crowded square of Maple Bend to the quiet, windswept hill where Elias made his home was undertaken in a silence that was entirely different from the one that had preceded it. This was not the heavy, dread-filled silence of the auction block, nor was it the shocked, breathless silence that had followed Elias's extraordinary offer. This was a fragile, delicate quiet, thick with unspoken emotion and the colossal weight of a future that had, just moments before, been irrevocably altered. Elias guided the wagon, with Oak plodding steadily forward, and the Miller family followed behind in their own small, rickety cart, which now held the pitifully few personal belongings they had been allowed to keep: a small trunk of clothes, a quilt and had made, a few cherished pots and Thomas's tools, which a sympathetic neighbor had secretly purchased and returned to him. The clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels were the only sounds, a slow, rhythmic percussion accompanying their thoughts. Elias did not try to fill the silence with empty words. He understood that the family needed time to simply breathe, to let the reality of their rescue sink in, to release the terror that had gripped them for days and begin, tentatively, to trust in the safety that had been promised. He could see them in his mind's eye, huddled together in their cart, their faces likely a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and a fear so deep it would not vanish simply because a kind man had spoken up for them. They were traveling into the unknown, placing their lives and their future into the hands of a virtual stranger, and no amount of kindness could immediately erase the trauma of being treated as property, of seeing their entire life dismantled and sold off before their eyes. Elias's heart ached for them, and he silently vowed to do everything in his power to prove that their trust was not misplaced. As the wagon began its slow ascent up the final hill toward his ranch, Elias felt an unfamiliar flutter of nervousness in his own stomach. He saw his home through their potential eyes: the simple, weathered wooden house, the functional but not fancy barn, the pastures dotted with sheep, the well, the woodpile. It was a place of honest work and simple comforts, but it was not grand. It was a home that had known silence for too long. He brought the wagon to a halt in the yard and climbed down, turning to watch as the miller's cart came to a stop behind him. He saw Thomas helping and down, his movements stiff with pride and shame. He saw the children clambering down, their eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings, a mixture of curiosity and wariness on their young faces. Elias approached them slowly, giving them space. "This is it," he said, his voice soft. "It's not much, but it's sturdy. The wind can blow fierce up here, but these walls have seen many a storm through." He gestured toward the house. Ann's eyes traveled over the structure, and he saw her notice the small, neat garden plot, now gone to seed for the winter, and the sturdy porch. Thomas's gaze swept over the barn and the pastures, assessing the state of the fences and the health of the livestock with a farmer's automatic eye. The children simply stared, clutching their mother's hands. Elias led the way to the front door and pushed it open, stepping inside. The main room was exactly as he had left it, the hearth cold, his single bowl and cup on the table, the two closed bedroom doors. It was clean, but starkly, undeniably empty. He turned to the family, who had followed him in and now stood just inside the doorway, a small island of uncertainty in the large, quiet space. Elias walked over to the first closed door and pushed it open. The room inside was small, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest for belongings. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. "This room," he said to Thomas, and has been waiting for you." He then crossed to the second door and opened it. This room was slightly larger, with two small beds and a smaller third cot tucked in the corner that Elias had built long ago for a hope that never came to be. "And this one," he said, his voice catching just slightly as he looked at Peter, Lily, and Rose, "has been waiting for a very long time for children to fill it." The gesture, the simple act of showing them that there was a specific prepared space for them, seemed to break the last of the ice, and brought a hand to her mouth, and a single, quiet sob escaped her. It was not a sob of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. Thomas put a steadying arm around her shoulders, and for the first time, he looked directly at Elias, and his eyes, though still shadowed with the pain of recent days, held a glimmer of profound gratitude. We expected the barn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Elias shook his head firmly. "This is not that kind of arrangement," he said. "This is your home. You are not servants here. You are family." He said the word again, making it real. He then showed them the rest of the house, the pantry, which was modestly stocked, the hearth, which he promised would always have a fire on cold nights, the pump at the sink that drew fresh, cold water from the well. He showed him where the pots and pans were, giving her dominion over the kitchen without saying it. He showed Thomas the tool shed, inviting his expertise without demand. That evening, a miracle occurred in the house on the hill. Elias lit a fire in the hearth, and its warm, crackling glow pushed back the shadows in the main room. And, with a purpose that seemed to heal her with every motion, investigated the supplies and began to prepare a stew, chopping vegetables and humming softly under her breath, a sound so ordinary and yet so magical that it brought tears to Elias's eyes. The children, emboldened by the warmth and the smell of cooking food, began to explore the main room, their whispers and quiet questions filling the air instead of the oppressive silence. Peter asked Elias about the sheep, and Lily found an old, friendly cat that lived in the barn and had followed them in. Thomas sat at the table, watching his wife and children, the rigid tension in his shoulders slowly beginning to ease. When the stew was ready, they all sat around the table. It was a tight fit. Elias's single chair was joined by every stool and bench he owned. The table, which had for so long held only one set of cutlery, was now crowded with bowls, and the ladle was passed from hand to hand. For a moment, before anyone began to eat, they all just looked at each other in the flickering firelight, the lonely rancher and the family who had lost everything. And then, tentatively, a smile broke out on Rose's little face. It was answered by one on Elias's. The sound that followed was the most beautiful sound Elias had heard in 20 years, the sound of a family sharing a meal. The clink of spoons against bowls, the gentle request for bread to be passed, the soft conversation. It was not a business arrangement. It was the first fragile, beautiful note of a new symphony, a song of healing and hope that began to play in the house on the lonely hill, which was lonely no more. The change that settled over the hilltop ranch in the days and weeks that followed was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, gentle, and profound transformation, like the first warm rays of spring sunshine coaxing life from the frozen earth. It was a healing, a mending of broken spirits, and a quiet filling of empty spaces, both within the walls of the house and within the hearts of those who now called it home. The rhythm of life established itself anew, a symphony composed of many instruments instead of a single, lonely melody. The first morning had been tentative, a dance of polite uncertainty as Elias, Thomas, and the children navigated their new reality. But necessity and a shared desire for harmony quickly smoothed the rough edges. Thomas, though his body was still weakened from his injury and the terrible stress of the auction, was a farmer to his very soul. He could not sit idle for long. On the second day, he joined Elias on his morning rounds, moving a bit slowly at first, but his experienced eyes immediately saw things that Elias, in his solitude, had learned to overlook: a fence post that was beginning to rot at the base, a gutter on the barn that had come loose, a patch of pasture that could be better utilized for grazing. What began as a suggestion offered with humility: perhaps, if it's no trouble, we could brace that post before the winter winds take it down, quickly evolved into a partnership. Elias, who had borne the weight of every decision and every chore alone for decades, found an immense relief in sharing the burden. He discovered that Thomas possessed a deep, intuitive knowledge of land and animal husbandry that was different from his own, and together their skills complemented each other, making the ranch not just maintained, but improved. They worked side by side, their conversation initially focused on the tasks at hand: the best way to mend a stone wall, the rotation of a sheep to fresh grass, the temperament of a particular ewe. But as the days passed, the conversations deepened, moving from the practicalities of the ranch to the stories of their lives. Elias spoke of his late wife, his voice soft with a love that had never diminished. Thomas, in turn, haltingly at first, then with more flow, spoke of his fear of failing his family, of the accident that had stolen his strength, of the deep shame of the auction. These were not easy words to say, but they were spoken under the vast, open sky, to the steady rhythm of shared labor, and the very act of speaking them seemed to lessen their power, allowing the wounds to finally begin to close. Inside the house, a similar magic was unfolding, and moved through the kitchen and main room with a quiet, capable grace that transformed the house from a shelter into a home. She did not take over. She wove herself into the fabric of the place. She learned where Elias kept his tea, and soon a pot was always warm on the stove. She discovered the herbs growing wild near the woodline and began incorporating them into her cooking, filling the house with new, wonderful aromas. She took charge of the chickens, and the number of eggs collected each morning doubled. She and Elias developed a silent language of mutual respect. He would bring in an extra pail of milk, and she would have a fresh-baked biscuit waiting for him. She mended his shirts without being asked, and he, in turn, brought her a beautiful piece of sanded pine from the workshop, so she would have a better surface for rolling dough. The emptiness of the house was steadily filled not just with objects, but with purpose and care. For the children, the hilltop became a world of wonder and gradual rediscovery of their childhood. Peter, eager to emulate the men, became Elias's shadow. Elias, who had never had a son, found a deep, unexpected joy in teaching the boy how to properly hold a hammer, how to approach a nervous calf, how to read the weather in the clouds. Peter absorbed every word, his earlier fear replaced by a growing confidence. Elias even taught him to ride on Old Oak, walking patiently beside the gentle horse as Peter, initially nervous, then thrilled, learned to sit tall in the saddle. The sound of the boys' laughter ringing across the pasture was a melody Elias never knew he had been waiting his whole life to hear. Lily and Rose, freed from the fear that had made them silent shadows of their mother, blossomed like the wildflowers that dotted the meadow. They discovered the cat had kittens in the hayloft, and their days were filled with the serious business of playing with them. They helped their mother in the garden, pulling weeds and planting a few late-season seeds she had saved, their small hands carefully patting the earth. They filled jam jars with water and placed bouquets of wilting dandelions and clover on the windowsill, declaring them beautiful. Their giggles and whispered secrets became a constant, gentle music in the house, a sound that now seemed to Elias as natural and necessary as the wind itself. Evenings were the best time. The large wooden table, once so vast and empty for one man, was now the heart of the home. It was crowded with bowls of Anne's hearty stews and fresh bread. The conversation was a lively mix of the day's events. Peter describing his ride on Oak, Thomas and Elias discussing a repair on the barn roof, the girls chattering about the kittens. After supper, Elias would sometimes bring out a worn deck of cards, and they would play simple games by the light of the kerosene lamp, the room warm and filled with easy laughter. On cooler nights, they would simply sit by the hearth, the fire crackling comfortingly, sometimes in a comfortable silence, sometimes with Elias telling a story from his youth. The terrible word servitude was never spoken because it had no place here. They were not a rancher and his workers. They were a family, each member contributing what they could, each healing the others simply by being present, by sharing the load, by filling the lonely spaces with the simple, profound gift of their company. The hill was no longer a place of isolation. It was a sanctuary, a place of shared labor and shared rest, where broken pieces were gently found and fitted back together, creating something new, stronger, and more beautiful than what had been there before. The seasons on the hilltop ranch turned with a gentle, inevitable rhythm, each one layering new memories upon the foundation of those first fragile weeks. The fierce winds of autumn gave way to the deep, silent snows of winter, which blanketed the land in a hushed, pristine white. The house, which had once echoed with every creak of a floorboard, now stood as a beacon of warmth and light against the long, dark nights, its windows glowing amber against the blue twilight, smoke curling contentedly from its chimney. Inside, the hearth was always lit, and the smell of baking bread and simmering soups was a permanent, comforting presence. The winter was not a time of loneliness, but of closeness. They spent evenings mending tools by the fire, the children learning to knit with, and Elias teaching Peter how to whittle a piece of soft pine into a whistle. The sound of the wind outside was no longer a mournful cry, but a reminder of the warmth and safety within their walls. When the thaw came, it revealed not just the earth beneath the snow, but the profound changes that had taken root in all of them. Thomas's shoulders, once permanently stooped with worry and pain, were now straight and strong. The lines of stress on his face had softened, replaced by the laugh lines that crinkled around his eyes when he watched his children play or shared a joke with Elias over their work. Anne's hands, always capable, now moved with a surety that spoke of a woman who was not just surviving, but truly living, her spirit nourished by the peace and purpose she had found. The children were thriving, their faces rosy with health, their voices loud and confident as they chased each other around the yard, their earlier fears a distant memory. It was on one such evening, as winter reluctantly loosened its grip and the first tentative signs of spring whispered in the air, that they all found themselves gathered on the porch. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of fiery oranges and deep purples, a performance that now, finally, had an audience to appreciate its full glory. They sat in a comfortable silence, wrapped in blankets, watching the day end. The only sounds were the contented bleating of sheep settling in for the night and the distant call of an owl greeting the twilight. It was Thomas who broke the silence, his voice quiet and thoughtful, carrying a weight of gratitude that had been building within him for months. He turned to Elias, his expression serious in the fading light. "Elias," he began, "what you did for us at that auction. You saved us from a terrible fate, one I don't even like to think about. You gave us all of this." He gestured around him at the ranch, the house, his family. "We can never repay you. We could work every day for the rest of our lives and still not come close to repaying that debt." Elias listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the last sliver of sun was disappearing. He let Thomas's words hang in the cool evening air for a moment before he turned to look at him, and then at Anne, and finally at the children, who were listening intently. A soft, profound smile touched his lips, a smile that held the memory of all his years of solitude and the joy of their ending. He shook his head slowly, his voice warm and sure. "You already have," he said simply. He paused, searching for the right words to explain the inexplicable. "When I rode into town that day, I thought I was going to buy supplies. Salt for the sheep, flour for my kitchen. I thought my life was about those things, the things I could hold in my hands, the work I could do alone." He looked down at his own rough, calloused hands, then back up at the family before him. When I saw that notice, and then when I saw you all standing there, something in me broke open. I shouted out those words. They're mine, but I didn't understand what I was truly saying. I thought perhaps I was buying help for my ranch. A strong back to mend my fences, a capable hand to help with the chores. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. But I was wrong. That was just a shell of it. The truth is, I was finding a family for my heart. His eyes glistened in the twilight as he looked at each of them. You have filled my home with laughter. You have filled my table with conversation. You have filled my days with purpose that goes beyond baling hay or shearing sheep. Peter, you have given me a son's enthusiasm to teach. Lily, Rose, you have given me a father's joy in watching you grow. Thomas, you have given me a brother's partnership. And, he said, his voice softening even further, you have given this house a mother's care, a warmth that has been missing for more years than I can count. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. The greatest treasure a man can ever have isn't the land he walks on or the money in his pocket. It can't be bought at any auction, not for $5 or $5,000. It's the people you get to share your life with. It's the love you give and the love you receive in return. You haven't taken anything from me. You have given me everything. His words settled over them, a final, gentle benediction on their new life together. They understood then that there was no debt. There was only a family, forged not by blood, but by choice and by kindness. The Miller family knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were home. And Elias knew, as he looked at their faces in the gathering dusk, that he would never, ever eat supper alone again. He had learned the world's greatest lesson, that the truest wealth is measured in shared sunsets, in laughter around a full table, and in the love that fills a once lonely house, making it a home. If you enjoyed this story of kindness and found family, please like, subscribe, and share with others. Your support helps us bring more heartwarming tales to life. Thank you for reading.